The dust swirled across the parched street of Prosperity, Wyoming territory, as Grace Jackson stumbled toward the only establishment still showing signs of life in the dying mining town. The year was 1878, and the promise of gold had evaporated along with the town's fortune, leaving behind desperate souls and broken dreams. Her once fine dress, now tattered and stained from weeks on the trail, hung from her thin frame as she pushed open the door to the Broken Spoke saloon with trembling hands. The piano music faltered as heads turned toward the unexpected visitor. Grace hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her vision swam as she scanned the room filled with hard-faced men, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something darker that made her clutch her worn carpet bag tighter against her chest. "I need work," she announced, her voice cracking from thirst. "Any work at all. I can cook, clean, mend clothing." When no one responded, desperation pushed her further. "I can work for food," she pleaded, her green eyes searching the room. "Just food." A tall figure rose from a corner table, spurs jingling quietly as he approached. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the sun-weathered skin and the steady blue eyes assessing her. The room grew quieter as he stopped before her, towering over her petite frame. "Work for my heart instead," the cowboy answered, his voice low and steady. The words hung in the air as the saloon patrons watched, curious about this strange exchange. Grace blinked in confusion, unsure if hunger had affected her hearing. "I don't understand." He removed his hat, revealing dark blonde hair and a face that, while not conventionally handsome, carried a strength that was undeniable. "My ranch needs a housekeeper, miss. 3 meals a day, a room of your own, and fair wages." He extended a calloused hand. "Daniel Yates, madam." "My place is half a day's ride from here." She hesitated, studying him. In her 22 years, Grace had learned to be wary of men bearing gifts, especially since her father's death had left her with nothing but debts and unwanted suitors looking to claim their piece of what remained. But something in Daniel Yates' steady gaze spoke of reliability, and hunger made decisions simpler. "Grace Jackson," she replied, accepting his handshake with as much dignity as she could muster. "When would I start?" "Now, if you're able," he said, retrieving his hat. "My supplies are loaded and I was heading back tonight." Before she could respond, her knees buckled. Daniel caught her before she hit the floor, his strong arms steadying her. "First, let's get some food in you," he said, guiding her to his table where the remains of a stew still steamed in a bowl. Grace didn't remember much after the first few bites of food. The rich broth and tender meat overwhelmed her senses as she fought to eat slowly, aware of Daniel watching her with concerned eyes. When she finished, he settled his bill and helped her to his wagon outside. The journey to his ranch passed in a blur as Grace drifted between exhausted sleep and waking to the gentle rocking of the wagon beneath a vast canopy of stars. Daniel spoke little, offering her water occasionally and stopping once to wrap his coat around her shoulders when the night air grew cold. Dawn was breaking when they crested a hill, revealing a modest valley below. A sturdy log house stood near a small creek with a barn and corral beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney, and as they drew closer, Grace could see a figure moving about the yard. "My foreman, Elijah," Daniel explained. "And his wife, Margaret, helps with cooking when I'm away." Grace straightened her dress and attempted to smooth her tangled hair, acutely aware of how she must look after weeks of hard travel. "Mr. Yates, I should tell you, I've never actually been a housekeeper before. I can cook basic meals and keep things tidy," but Daniel's mouth quirked into what might have been a smile. "Neither have I, which is why my place looks like it does. We'll figure it out together." The next days passed in a blur of activity as Grace settled into her role. Daniel's home was indeed in desperate need of a woman's touch. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with 2 bedrooms off to one side and a small office that doubled as storage space. Everything was functional but Spartan. suggesting a man who viewed his home as merely a place to eat and sleep between long days of work. Grace tackled the dust and disorder with determined energy, grateful for the shelter and regular meals. Daniel was gone most days from sunup to sundown, working with his small herd of cattle or helping neighboring ranchers. When present, he was quiet but not unfriendly, answering her questions about the ranch and occasionally bringing back small items from town that he thought might make her work easier: a new broom, better cooking pots, fabric for curtains. A week into her stay, Grace was humming to herself while kneading bread dough when Daniel entered unexpectedly, his boots muddy from the spring melt. "Sorry," he said, immediately stepping back. "Didn't mean to track dirt onto your clean floor." "It's your floor," Grace reminded him, smiling despite herself at his contrite expression. "And mud is easier to clean than dust, at least you can see it." He removed his boots at the door first and approached the table where she worked. "That smells good." "It will taste better once it's baked," she promised. "You mentioned you hadn't had fresh bread in some time." Daniel nodded, watching her hands work the dough with a fascination that made her cheeks warm. "My mother used to bake," he said quietly, "before she died. Never could get bread to taste the same after." Grace hesitated, surprised by the personal revelation from this taciturn man. "How old were you when she passed?" 14, he replied, turning to wash at the basin she'd filled earlier. "Father followed 3 years later. Left me the ranch and not much else." She shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise, considering his words. "My father died last autumn, influenza. I tried to keep our boarding house running, but the debts." She trailed off, not wanting to burden him with her story. Daniel dried his hands on a towel, his eyes meeting hers across the kitchen. "Is that why you came west? Running from debts? Running towards something new," she corrected, though his assessment wasn't entirely wrong. "My cousin wrote about opportunities out here." By the time I reached her town, she'd moved on to Oregon. Grace smiled ruefully. "I had just enough money to get to prosperity and then you found me," Daniel finished, his expression unreadable. Grace nodded, unsure what to make of the intensity in his gaze. "Lucky for me you needed help." "Lucky for us both," he said quietly, before heading toward his office. As spring warmed into summer, Grace found herself settling into a comfortable rhythm at the Yates ranch. The house gradually transformed under her care, becoming a home rather than merely shelter. She planted a small kitchen garden, hung curtains she'd sewn from fabric Daniel brought from town, and even convinced him to help her move furniture to better arrange the main room. Daniel, too, seemed to be undergoing a subtle transformation. He began lingering over evening meals, sharing stories about his day or asking her opinions on ranch matters. Sometimes, he would read aloud from one of his few books while she mended clothes or prepared food for the next day. These quiet evenings became something Grace looked forward to, though she tried to remind herself that her position was temporary just until she saved enough to move on. One sweltering July afternoon, Grace was hanging laundry when riders appeared on the horizon. She shaded her eyes, making out 3 figures approaching fast. Daniel was checking fences on the north pasture, and Elijah had gone to town for supplies. Unease prickled along her spine as she hurried to finish her task. By the time the riders reached the yard, she was waiting on the porch, a shotgun propped against the wall within reach as Daniel had instructed. "Afternoon, madam," called the lead rider, a heavy-set man with a florid face partially hidden behind a bushy beard. "Looking for Daniel Yates." "He's not here," Grace answered, keeping her voice steady. "Expected back by sundown if you'd like to leave a message." The man exchanged glances with his companions. "That's a mighty long wait. Mind if we water our horses?" Before Grace could answer, the sound of hoofbeats announced another arrival. Daniel rode in from the east, his expression hardening as he took in the scene. He dismounted smoothly, positioning himself between Grace and the visitors. "Thornton," he acknowledged the bearded man. "What brings you to my property?" The man named Thornton shifted in his saddle. Word is you're not joining the association, Yates. Thought we might convince you otherwise. Nothing's changed since last month, Daniel replied evenly. I run my land my way. Thornton's gaze drifted to Grace. See, you've gotten yourself some company, though. Pretty addition to the place. Daniel's shoulders tensed. Miss Jackson is my housekeeper and not part of this conversation. State your business or move on. Cattlemen's Association is offering one last time, Thornton said, his pleasant tone belied by the hardness in his eyes. Join up, pay your dues, follow the rules. And if I don't, Thornton shrugged, winter's hard on small spreads, accidents happen, cattle stray, fires start. His eyes flicked to the house behind Grace. Would be a shame to lose such a nice place. Grace felt ice in her veins despite the summer heat. Daniel's hand drifted closer to his holstered pistol, but his voice remained calm. I believe you've delivered your message, Thornton. Now get off my land. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before Thornton nodded slightly. Think about it, Yates. We'll be back for your answer in a week. With that, the three men wheeled their horses and rode away. As soon as they were out of sight, Daniel turned to Grace, his face tight with concern. Are you all right? She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. Who were they? Daniel guided her inside, checking that the door was secure behind them. Representatives of the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association. They're pressuring small ranchers to join or face consequences. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. They want to control grazing rights, water access, even what we can charge for our cattle. And if you don't join, Grace asked, though she'd already heard the threats. They'll try to run me out, he said simply. They've done it to others. Grace filled 2 cups with water, passing one to Daniel. What will you do? He drank deeply before answering. Stand my ground. This land was my father's dream. He worked himself to death building something that belonged to him alone. His blue eyes met hers. I won't surrender that to men like Thornton. That evening, after a quiet meal, Daniel unexpectedly asked if she would accompany him outside. The summer twilight bathed the landscape in soft purple light as they walked toward a small rise behind the house. At the top stood a single oak tree and beneath it 2 simple wooden crosses. My parents, Daniel explained as they approached. Father always said this was the prettiest view on the whole ranch. You can see clear to the mountains on a good day. Grace stood silently beside him, understanding the significance of his bringing her to this private place. After a moment, she gently took his hand in hers. His fingers tightened around hers, warm and strong. I've been thinking about what Thornton said, Daniel spoke finally. About the dangers of a small spread facing winter alone. Grace's heart sank, fearing he might be considering giving in to the association's demands. You've managed before. Yes, he agreed, but always just barely, and now. He turned to face her, still holding her hand. Now I have more to lose. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Daniel, I know you came here temporary-like, he continued quickly, that you've been saving to move on, but I've grown accustomed to your presence, Grace, more than accustomed. He looked down at their joined hands. I find myself hoping you might consider staying, permanently. Grace's heart thundered in her chest. As your housekeeper, his eyes met hers again, vulnerability clear in their blue depths. As my wife, if you were willing. Though I know it's sudden and perhaps unwelcome, it's not unwelcome, she interrupted softly. Not at all. Hope brightened his features. You've come to care for me then, Grace smiled, remembering his words from their first meeting. I came to work for food, she said, stepping closer to him, but I find I'm working for your heart instead, and you already have mine. Daniel's answering smile transformed his serious face. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, he bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle and brief, but it sealed a promise between them that needed no further words as twilight deepened around the ranch that was becoming truly her home. The week passed in a strange mixture of joy and tension. During the days, Daniel and Elijah prepared for potential trouble, checking fences, moving cattle closer to the house, and keeping rifles loaded. At night, Daniel and Grace planned their future together, speaking of improvements to the ranch and the possibility of children someday. On the morning Thornton was due to return, Daniel asked Grace to remain inside while he and Elijah waited in the yard. She agreed reluctantly, watching through the window as the same 3 riders approached, along with 2 additional men. Though she couldn't hear the conversation clearly, she saw Daniel standing firm, shaking his head at whatever Thornton proposed. The tension escalated until one of the new men drew his pistol. Before he could aim, rifle shots rang out from the direction of the barn, where neighbors Daniel had called upon for help had positioned themselves. The brief firefight ended with Thornton and his men retreating, one clutching a wounded arm. As they disappeared over the rise, Daniel rushed to the house, relief evident on his face when he found Grace unharmed. "It's not over," he warned her, "but we've shown them we won't be intimidated." Over the following weeks, small incidents plagued the ranch: a cut fence line, a mysteriously spooked herd, a poisoned water hole, but each time, Daniel and his allies responded swiftly, minimizing the damage. The Cattlemen's Association, facing unexpected resistance not just from the Yates Ranch but from other small holders who had banded together, gradually reduced their pressure. By September, preparations for Daniel and Grace's wedding were underway. The ceremony would be small, held at the ranch with just a few neighbors and the circuit preacher who visited the area monthly. Grace sewed a new dress from fine blue fabric Daniel had ordered specially from Cheyenne, and together they prepared the house for the guests who would celebrate with them. The night before the wedding, a late summer thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Grace stood on the covered porch, watching lightning illuminate the mountains as Daniel finished securing the animals in the barn. When he joined her, rain dripped from his hat brim as he removed it. "Everything's battened down," he reported, hanging his wet coat by the door. "Should blow over by morning." Grace nodded, still watching the storm. "I've been thinking about tomorrow," she said quietly. Daniel stepped closer, concern in his eyes. "Having second thoughts." She turned to him, smiling at the worry in his expression. "No, never that. I was thinking about how much has changed since I stumbled into that saloon, how close I came to passing through prosperity altogether." "Providence," Daniel said, taking her hands in his. "That's what my mother would have called it. Do you think she would have approved of me?" Grace asked, a question that had lingered in her mind. Daniel's eyes softened. "She would have loved you for bringing life back to this place and to me." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I never expected to find someone who would understand what this land means to me, someone willing to fight for it alongside me. It's my home now, too," Grace said simply. "Our home." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean for their new beginning. Grace dressed with trembling fingers, the reality of the day finally settling over her. She was no longer a desperate young woman pleading for work. She was about to become Mrs. Daniel Yates, mistress of a ranch that was modest in size but rich in promise. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, with Daniel's steady voice pronouncing his vows clearly for all to hear. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, the small gathering of neighbors cheered as Daniel kissed his bride, no longer the reserved man who had first offered her shelter. That evening, after the guests had departed and the house was quiet once more, Daniel and Grace stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. His arm encircled her waist, drawing her close against his side. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" he asked softly. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment filling her heart. "More than I believed possible," she answered honestly, "though I do wonder what comes next." Daniel chuckled, a sound she had grown to love for its rarity. "Next we build something that lasts. Something to pass down to our children someday." "Children?" she repeated, smiling at the thought. "A whole houseful if you're willing," he said, turning to face her. "This land needs more than just the 2 of us to keep it thriving." Grace wrapped her arms around his neck, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "I think that can be arranged, Mr. Yates." As autumn painted the landscape in brilliant hues, Daniel and Grace settled into married life with surprising ease. The house, already transformed by Grace's earlier efforts, became truly their shared home as Daniel added his own touches, building new shelves for Grace's growing collection of books, expanding the kitchen to give her more space for baking, planning a larger garden for the following spring. Their evenings were no longer spent in separate rooms but shared in the comfort of their marriage bed, where they discovered the depths of their feelings for one another. Grace found that Daniel's quiet nature masked a passionate heart, while he marveled at the strength and determination that had brought her into his life. Word reached them in late October that the Cattlemen's Association had suffered setbacks beyond their small corner of Wyoming. A federal investigation into their intimidation tactics had begun, prompted by complaints from multiple small ranchers. Thornton and his associates had apparently moved their operations further north, away from the scrutiny. "You think they'll come back?" Grace asked as they discussed the news over breakfast. Daniel considered, pouring more coffee for them both. "Eventually, perhaps. Men like that don't give up power easily, but will be stronger when they do." He reached across the table to take her hand. "We won't face them alone." Grace squeezed his fingers, grateful for the community they had built. What had begun as Daniel's solitary stand had grown into an alliance of neighboring ranchers committed to defending their independence. Weekly gatherings rotated between properties, combining work with social connection as families helped one another with harvests, repairs, and preparations for winter. As the first snow dusted the mountains in November, Grace confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. She was carrying their first child. Daniel's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for, joy mingled with protective concern, as he immediately began planning modifications to their home to accommodate their growing family. "We'll need a proper nursery," he declared, measuring the small second bedroom that had once been Grace's and now served as storage. "And perhaps an addition come spring if the winter isn't too hard." Grace laughed at his enthusiasm. "The baby won't need its own room for months yet, Daniel." "There's time." He pulled her into his arms, his hand gently resting against her still flat stomach. "Time that will pass faster than we expect," he said softly. "I want everything to be perfect for both of you." As winter settled over the valley, Grace found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been alone and desperate, pleading for work in exchange for a meal. Now she was the beloved wife of a man who had offered her not just sustenance but his heart, carrying their child beneath her heart, secure in a home they had built together. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fireplace in the main room, Daniel presented her with a small wooden box. "What's this?" Grace asked, surprised by the unexpected gift. "Open it," he urged, an unusual nervousness in his manner. Inside the box lay a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When Grace opened it, she found a tiny portrait of Daniel on one side, the other left empty. "For the baby when it comes," he explained, "so you can keep us both close to your heart." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she clasped the precious gift around her neck. "It's beautiful, Daniel, but how? When did you have this made?" he smiled, drawing her close beside him on the settle. "I had Elijah take it to Cheyenne last month. It was my mother's, but I had it repaired and the portrait added." His fingers traced the chain at her throat. "Seems right that it should belong to you now." Grace leaned against him, watching the firelight dance across the room that had become the center of their world. Outside, snow fell softly in the darkness, but within their home, warmth and love created a sanctuary against the harsh Wyoming winter. "Tell me again," she requested softly, "about the day we met." Daniel chuckled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "You were the most determined woman I'd ever seen, standing in that saloon like a queen despite being half-starved. When you said you'd work for food, something inside me just spoke without thinking." "Work for my heart instead," Grace quoted, smiling at the memory. "I thought you were mad." "I might have been," he admitted. offering employment to a stranger, bringing you home without knowing anything about you except your name. "Why did you?" she asked, a question she'd wondered about but never voiced. "There must have been other women in need of work before me." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering. "There were," he acknowledged. "But none of them looked at me the way you did, like you were seeing the man, not just the rancher or the employer, like you were already assessing whether I could be trusted." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "It made me want to prove worthy of that assessment." Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings. The pastures greened, calves were born to the expanding herd, and Grace's body rounded with the child growing within. Daniel hired additional help for the season, insisting that Grace reduce her workload as her pregnancy advanced. In early June, as wildflowers carpeted the hillsides, Grace gave birth to their son after a difficult labor that left Daniel pacing outside their bedroom while the local midwife attended his wife. When finally permitted entry, he approached the bed with reverence, taking in the sight of Grace, exhausted but radiant, holding their swaddled infant. "Meet your son, Daniel," she whispered, passing the tiny bundle to his trembling hands. Daniel cradled the child with awe, counting fingers and toes before looking up at Grace with eyes shining with unshed tears. "He's perfect," he managed, "just like his mother." They named him James after Grace's father, with Thomas as a middle name to honor Daniel's. The baby thrived in the loving environment of the ranch, his lusty cries and later his laughter filling the house that had once been so silent and empty. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered alongside him. Daniel's careful management, combined with the alliance he had formed with neighboring smallholders, allowed them to negotiate better prices for their cattle and resist further pressure from larger interests trying to control the territory. Grace, balancing motherhood with her role as the ranch's mistress, found unexpected fulfillment in teaching the children of neighboring families alongside her son. What began as informal reading lessons in their front room gradually evolved into a small school, with Grace using her own education to provide learning opportunities previously unavailable in the remote area. By the time James was 5, the Yates family welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth, whose arrival coincided with the completion of the larger home Daniel had been building for years, adding rooms and comforts as their family and prosperity grew. On warm summer evenings, they would often sit on the wide porch of their new home, watching the children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. During one such evening, as James chased fireflies and baby Elizabeth slept in Grace's arms, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "You ever think about that day in prosperity?" he asked, his hand finding Grace's as they sat side by side. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't walked into that saloon," Grace smiled, looking out over the land that had become the foundation of their shared life. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I look at all we've built together, and it seems as though it couldn't have happened any other way." She turned to meet his gaze, still moved by the love she found there after all these years. "As if we were always meant to find each other, even at our lowest moments." Daniel nodded, understanding her meaning without need for further explanation. He rose from his chair, lifting a sleeping Elizabeth from her mother's arms and extending his hand to help Grace to her feet. "James," he called softly to their son, "time to come inside." The boy abandoned his chase reluctantly, running to join his parents as they stood silhouetted against the golden light spilling from their home. Together, the family that had begun with a desperate plea and an unexpected answer made their way inside, closing the door against the gathering darkness as the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky.